Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 9th. We will be hearing the presentation, Innovative Financing for Transportation Projects. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the box located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of today's presentation during our Q&A. And if your question is for a particular panelist, I just ask that you please indicate which panelist you would like to answer that question. On your screen is a list of our 2018 members. Thanks to all of these members for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see a chapter division listed, we just ask that you reach out and ask them to join us. Today in particular, our webcast is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division of the APA, and you can learn more about them by visiting planning.org/divisions. This slide is a little useless at the moment, but we do have 2 remaining webcasts for this year. And I believe that both of them are up on our webcast webpage, and you can actually click and register for them at this point, but my screen did not update for this. So like I said, we have 2 left, and I believe both of them are or will be by the end of today ready for registration. So please visit our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, to register for these. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education, and you can check those out on our webcast webpage, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to log today's credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and up at the top you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. This will be particularly useful as we're already booking 2019 sessions. In fact, we don't even have any January or February dates left. So we've got many sessions already in the works, so be sure to like us on Facebook so you can get up-to-date info when we have them posted to our webpage and ready for you to register. We are recording today's webcast. You can view a recording of it on our YouTube channel. Just head over there and search Planning Webcast. You can view this and over 200 other of our webcasts that are available for free. And we'll also have a copy, PDF form of this presentation on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, where you can find this and all of our other webcast PDFs. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our first presenter of the day, Jennifer Mitchell, and she'll introduce herself and get us all started. Jennifer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Mitchell. I'm Director of the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. We are the agency in Virginia that has funding and oversight responsibilities for public transportation in the state, along with freight rail and passenger rail projects. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the major advancements that have been occurring over the past 4 years in how we have been allocating funding at the transit and rail side, and also generating new and innovative revenues for transit as well. So I'll just do that by first going through some major legislative developments, talk with you about what's called our Smart Scale process, toll revenues that we've been utilizing from hot lanes for transit and rail, and then reforms that we're currently making to our statewide transit program. So again, our agency, Department of Rail and Public Transportation, we are actually not part of the Department of Transportation. We are a separate agency, which means we're a little bit different than in other states. But we also have our own dedicated funding sources, part of that being through our Transportation Trust Fund, but also some separate funding sources that directly go to transit and rail and not, again, through our state DOT, which is actually our highway agency. We don't operate anything. We do feasibility and planning studies. We allocate funding. We develop policy guidance for the allocation of funds and technical assistance statewide. A little bit about our footprint within Virginia. We have a number of stakeholders, including 40 different transit systems across the state. WMATA being the largest one. We're one of the Virginia stakeholders, along with our jurisdictions in Metro, along with DC and Maryland. We have a number of other transit systems that range from very small properties with just a few buses up to much larger regional transit agencies. Human service operators, commuter rail service. We work very closely and have seats on the boards of all of the MPOs in the state, and also work with the railroads across the state. We fund 9 intercity routes today for Amtrak service, which means we have a big role in planning and operating those in partnership with Amtrak. So a little bit about some of the overall shifts that have occurred in Virginia over the past 5 years. What we've seen has really been a real watershed in transportation funding, not just in the types of funding, but really in how it's being allocated for Virginia. This really started back in 2013, where the General Assembly created increased the sales tax on wholesale gasoline and dedicated that to transportation. This was actually, they also switched it where the original tax was a per gallon tax and made it a sales tax on the wholesale gasoline price instead. They also created new regional funding sources in Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia. In Northern Virginia, it's called, it's a combination of an incremental sales tax and some other funding sources, generating about $300 million a year. And in Hampton Roads, they created a new Transportation Accountability Commission that is also allocating regional sales taxes for transportation purposes. What I did want to point out about this was the first time that the state had increased revenues for transportation since 1987. So it had been quite a while, and this was a big, very important bill for us. However, the new statewide sources, when they switched from the per gallon tax to wholesale gasoline, we're actually not generating much more on a statewide basis than we were before. The most, where we've really seen the increases has been in the regional funding sources. After that, in 2014, we saw new legislation which directed the Secretary of Transportation to now prioritize transportation projects using a number of measures. And this has all been part of a bigger shift in the Commonwealth to performance-based funding. We had another bill in 2015 which created additional funding for public transit in the neighborhood of about $20 million a year. And then in 18, we had a funding bill last year which created dedicated funding for WMATA and also directed our Commonwealth Transportation Board to start prioritizing transit funding as well. So first, Smart Scale. Smart Scale is the funds that were traditionally thought of as highway funds that were allocated by VDOT. These have now been broadened so that these funds are actually eligible to be used for transit and rail projects as well, and any projects that best meet the goals that are articulated in this program. The funds itself are just divided up into a statewide program and then a district grant program. We've been allocating funds now on a biennial basis so that we have more funds to allocate, which is approximately $1 billion in this current round. And most importantly, we now, the projects are driven by applications from localities and regional entities, as opposed to being driven by the state DOT. The projects must meet a need that's been identified in our statewide plan. But most importantly, once the projects are selected, they are then fully funded. That was a big change in the way that the state was doing business before, where they had a lot of projects in the 6-year plan that were provided a little bit of funding to kind of keep them on life support, but they may never have, they may have gotten right-of-way funding, but they never actually got fully funded for construction. So the evaluation factors that are laid out, and this is actually laid out in legislation, are safety, congestion mitigation, accessibility, land use, environmental impacts, and economic development. And you can see that's actually where we get the acronym of the scale. We have developed metrics for all of these, and each one of them are designed to be mode neutral. So we have transit projects and TDM projects that are being evaluated on the same basis as highway projects to determine which solutions best meet the transportation needs in the state. Then the projects get ranked based on their scores, and the scores are divided by the amount of state funding that they're requesting. That then develops a cost effectiveness score that all of the projects then get ranked upon, and our Commonwealth Transportation Board then makes decisions based on the rankings of those projects. It doesn't require that the CTB select projects that are ranked the highest, but if they do not, and if they choose to fund other projects that are ranked lower, they do need to be able to explain and justify those decisions. But so far, our board has been focused on selecting the projects that rate the highest. As you can see, on transit and rail, we've actually been very successful in having transit projects apply and receive funding under this. In round one, we had 7 projects that were funded at $31 million. On the right, you'll see a photo of the Hopper project. That's actually a circulator route in Lynchburg, Virginia, which was actually this is a picture of the ribbon cutting and the first smart scale project that opened in the state. In round two, we had 17 projects and a total of $168 million in funding. A large part of that was for a program of projects that were put together and submitted by Virginia Railway Express, which is our commuter rail system, and that is provides commuter rail services between Fredericksburg and Washington, D.C. And that program of projects was actually the highest ranking smart scale application that year. Next year, in round three, which we are currently in the evaluation process for right now, we have 16 projects that have been submitted for a total of $231 million. What we're actually seeing is that grantees are now submitting more projects that have transit and multimodal components to them because they realize that their roadway projects have a better chance of being funded if they have a multimodal component. So that's good. That's what we wanted to see. So now I'm going to move on to talking about some of our, we've had a number of major projects in which we've converted hot lanes to, HOV lanes to hot lanes in order to generate revenue. And those revenues are being used to improve the person throughput in these corridors. Whether those people are in single-family cars, whether they are in buses, or whether they are paying to use a car solo. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a purple line. That's actually I-66, what we call inside the Beltway. 495 is an existing hot lanes project, and that's with the orange line that extends north-south there. The green line to the left of that is I-66 outside the Beltway, and that's a separate P3 project that I'll talk about. And then on the far right, you'll see the blue line for I-395, and that is a hot lane, an extension of the existing I-95 hot lanes up to the border with Washington, D.C., that's also generating revenues that are being dedicated to transit. So first of all, I-66 inside the Beltway. This project began back in 2017, and originally this has actually been restricted since for a couple decades actually, where only HOV users could use I-66 inside the Beltway in the peak hours. And so this has actually now opened up those lanes to toll-paying customers. What we were actually seeing is that when the lanes were free, they were getting extremely congested with a lot of violators and not enough not enough HOV users. And so we introduced congestion pricing or variable pricing to be able to generate additional revenues, also to help expand the road that was very congested in one particular bottleneck. The funds themselves that are being generated, it's a minimum of $10 million a year. are going to transit, transportation demand management, bike, ped, and roadway projects in the corridor. The key here is that everything, with all of these tolling projects in Virginia, we have some case law that's determined that they need to be able to demonstrate that the toll payer is receiving some benefit from this. So all of the projects here are showing that they can take people off the roadway and remove congestion for the toll payer. We actually allow the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which is a body of local elected officials in Northern Virginia, to actually select the projects and recommend them for funding. Round one, we funded $9.8 million in transit projects, and then in the following year, $12 million. And we're going to enter our third cycle next year. I should say as well, this is not a P3 project. This project is actually being done by the state. VDOT is managing the toll collection and managing the pricing strategy on that, and then transferring the money to the localities for the transit projects. The benefits of this, again, it's all about moving more people through the corridor. So we're providing more travel choices and mobility options. We're increasing the person carrying capacity of the corridor by over 34,000 people, which is extremely significant in the DC area. And most importantly, we're providing a reliable, congestion-free ride during the peak hour. This is just a summary of some of the projects that have been funded last year. And again, these projects alone were moving another 2,000 people an hour through the corridor, which is saving us about 120,000 hours of travel delay each year. So very significant improvements in this very congested area. So I'm now going to transition to talking about I-66 outside the Beltway. This is a P3 project. The Commonwealth just entered into a concession agreement last year with a group called Express Mobility Partners. It's led by Centra, a Spanish company. This agreement, the way that we've actually defined the scope of the I-66 project is that it's a multimodal project that includes creation of a new hot lane, which was added to the existing HOV lanes in the corridor. We are maintaining the same amount of general purpose lanes in this corridor, but then adding enhanced transit service in the corridor and also park and ride projects in the corridor. It's the important thing to note that this was all defined as part of the core scope of work on the project that the bidders all bid on. And that included a stream of payments that's going to total $800 million over the next 50 years to support these enhanced transit services. So there's a bit of a distinction here. It's unlike I-66 inside the Beltway where we have money coming off the top of the project. This was actually defined as the base scope of work that the concessions price was essentially based on. In addition to that, when there were two teams that were bidding on the project, Express Mobility Partners committed to also making a $500 million concession payment up front for the project, which really represents the revenue potential in this corridor and the value. Those projects have been, again, they're going to improving other projects in the corridor, and $178 million of that $500 million is going to be going to transit and some park and ride projects in the corridor. The majority of that, I should say, is along to improvements along the Virginia Railway Express's Manassas line, which runs directly parallel to I-66 and really provides a major source of alternate mobility to users of I-66. And these, I should say that $800 million in funding is going to be used for both capital and also for operating funding for these new services. And this is just a map, a representation of some of the locations of the park and rides. We're going to be moving 2,000 to 4,000 more people per hour and eliminating 10.5 miles of congestion in each direction during the peak. So moving on to the I-95 and 395, this is a arrangement that the Commonwealth has with Transurban, which is a private partner that's already operating the I-95 congestion or I-95 hot lanes, which extends south from Northern Virginia towards Fredericksburg. This payment or this agreement for the extension of these lanes northward towards the border with DC are also going to generate new revenues that will be used for transit in the corridor. So with this one, the agreement with Transurban is generating $15 million a year for transit. I believe it's for 78 years, and it will include also an annual escalation fee. So we've worked on a study with the localities to determine which transit improvements and projects will have the most benefits up there for using those toll lanes and moving more people through that corridor. And we're going to prioritize all of those projects based on person throughput for prioritization and then recommendations for funding. Again, so very significant benefits there. We're going to see much higher volumes in the hot lanes, which also takes people out of the general purpose lanes, which we believe will lead to a 15% reduction in travel times for those people that are still using the general purpose lanes and not paying the toll. It'll also promote more HOV use throughout the day, whereas right now it didn't have that incentives to do that. We expect it to increase reliability and, again, improve capacity through there. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the reforms that came last year in our transportation funding. We're working through these right now. This, again, is reflecting our shift in Virginia of moving our transportation planning and programming decisions to a performance-based process. So this bill, a lot of people talked about this as the WMATA funding bill, but actually it did create more funding for WMATA, which is also being matched by DC and Maryland for a dedicated stream of $500 million per year. But in addition to that, it also provided a number of reforms to our transit programs. And I should say we've been working with our General Assembly to better, we've been improving our long-range projections of needs and working on asset management with all of the operators in the state. All of this is part of these accountability reforms. And should these and when these are implemented successfully, we do expect to be able to make the case for some additional funding for transit to help grow what we've got in the future. So we are working on a prioritization process, which is based on we have one separate process for state of good repair, which is based on asset management. So things like condition of an asset or age of an asset. And then for projects that provide expansion capacity, they're going to be analyzed based on the same factors that are used for smart scale. So congestion mitigation, economic development, and all the other factors there. However, we've developed measures that are more specific to transit projects. In addition, our bill included new strategic planning requirements. So now all of the major transit systems in the state will have to do a very robust strategic plan every 5 years, in which they'll be assessing their state of good repair needs, doing a very robust look at their fixed route bus services, and identifying ways to improve the efficiency of their systems. In the operating funding, we're now also allocating we provide operating funds to all the transit agencies in the state. It typically ranges from about 18% to 20% of each agency's operating costs every year. So we will now be allocating those based on service delivery factors and performance factors. Right now, we have some performance factors introduced, including passengers per revenue hour, passengers per revenue mile, and net cost per passenger. We are in the process of reviewing this with an advisory committee and putting together a new recommendation for a similar set of factors that will be used to allocate all of our operating funds. And the most important thing, again, is being able to demonstrate that all of these funds are being used to provide the correct incentives for increasing ridership and increasing service. So just wrapping up, all of these changes, when you see them combined and in the accumulation of them over the last 5 years, we've been working very hard on leveraging new funding sources that can be used for rail and transit, such as tolls and concession fees. We are really changing the paradigm for which we are making funding decisions in the state. We have a much more data-driven process based on prioritization and cost effectiveness. And most importantly, especially as you've seen with the Hot Lanes projects, prioritizing projects that move the most people, regardless of what mode they're in. And essential to all of this is accountability and transparency, which with all of these becoming more data-driven and providing a more transparent selection method to the public, is very important, as we see, as being able to make the case for the value of transit and other highway improvements and making the connections with additional funding in the future. So thank you. With that, I am now going to transfer this over to Jodie Misiak from WSP, and I look forward to taking your questions later.
Jodie, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hello, this is Jodie Misiak. I'm now unmuted, right?
You're good to go now.
Perfect. I'm Jodie Misiak. I'm a principal in WSP's Alternative Delivery Group. I specialize in assessment and implementation of appropriate innovative finance, procurement, alternative project delivery, public-private partnerships, program management, and value capture strategies for state and local governments. So today, I'm going to focus on a portion of that, the public-private partnership side, and specifically with respect to public transit. My work at WSP is informed by the roles that I've held in the public sector. My first role in the public sector was leading the Office of Innovative Project Delivery for the Maryland Department of Transportation. This involved the establishment of a clear framework for assessment and delivery of P3s, including supporting the development of Maryland's current P3 law. There had been previous iterations in the past, and leading development of Maryland's P3 regulations for transportation. Then building this program, we focused on advancing project delivery strategies that emphasize best value, performance-based metrics, asset lifecycle management, system accountability, and oversight of long-term operational functions. Really looking to some of our partners and sort of neighbors, such as Virginia, for strategies to enhance our programs and systems. During this time, we were screening projects across Maryland DOT's entire multimodal portfolio. So it included transit and aviation, and port infrastructure, road infrastructure. And two of the projects that were advanced to full P3 were I-95 travel plazas, which I won't be discussing today, but you could experience if you are ever driving on I-95 in Maryland, and the Purple Line light rail transit project, which I will be discussing today. Following my time at Maryland DOT, I joined US DOT to manage the implementation of the Build America Bureau, which was mandated under the FAST Act. The Build America Bureau was established to focus on developing a one-stop shop for state and local governments that were facing some of the same challenges that I did while I was at MDOT. This included the development of best practices, capacity building for innovative finance. In addition to consolidating the TIFIA, RIF, and private activity bonds programs under one umbrella. The Build America Bureau provides a number of resources that would be useful for the type of work that I was advancing back with the Purple Line. So I find these extremely useful when I'm recommending them to those following the same path. In the following slides, I'm going to step through the process that I followed for the Purple Line as we were building the case and thinking about the various aspects of a P3 delivery approach. And during this time, I'll reference certain USD DOT Build America Bureau resources that are useful for specific phases in this process. So let's get started first with making sure we're all on the same page with respect to the concept of P3s. There are various definitions out there for the situation that I'll be describing with the Purple Line. The definition that USDOT uses is really the most useful. Contractual agreements formed between a public agency and a private sector entity allows for greater private sector participation in the delivery and financing of transportation projects. This was the very similar to the definition we had in Maryland, and it really suggests a spectrum of different types of delivery methods that should be considered for large, complex projects. That spectrum includes a range of different types of contractual arrangements that have various levels of complexity and involvement from the private sector. At one end of the spectrum are delivery methods that involve significantly less private sector involvement. These are closer to the design bid build and design build delivery methods that are most common across the country. The other end of the spectrum are delivery methods that involve significantly more private sector involvement. This includes design, build, finance, operate, maintain approach that is being used for the Purple Line light rail transit project. So that will be the focus going forward. Another key distinction within public-private partnerships is between whether there is revenue risk being taken by the private sector, as in some of the toll road projects that were discussed, and other types of projects that have significant enough revenue to support the full cost of the project. On the other hand, other projects, such as the Purple Line, will rely on availability payments. These are payments from the government sponsor to the private concessionaire. Concessionaire is paid when they meet all of the key performance requirements of the contract, which can be lengthy and sometimes very specific, potentially including on-time service and cleanliness of facilities, just for instance. If the requirements are not met, there may be deductions to these payments. So it is another way of compensating the private sector when the asset does not necessarily support the use of user payments for the private sector's compensation. So there is a path to delivering a transit P3 that we followed in Maryland and that we have seen in other places that involves several steps, and I'll break down each of these in the coming slides. And they were really not necessarily steps that were checking the box or just going through the motions. Each step is important for building a case, and a very strong case for a unique and potentially complex delivery method to ensure that is resilient to both criticism and potential challenges, as well as the risks that the project will encounter going forward. So building a strong case early on will be important for a successful project later down the line. To give everyone a sense of the project that is the focus of this conversation, Purple Line in Maryland is a 16.2 mile light rail line between Bethesda in Montgomery County and New Carrollton in Prince George's County in Maryland, of course. So back in 2012, we started to think about potential delivery methods for the Purple Line. It was still in very much planning phase, but we were at the point where a potential delivery method needed to be identified and pursued. The project is, as you see, connects a wide range of areas across the metropolitan DC area region, and it connects with 4 branches of the Metro Rail system: Bethesda, Silver Spring, College Park, and New Carrollton, as well as MARC commuter line and Amtrak. So there are many connections, there are many interfaces, and this is going to be a brand new connection across the region that involved a large number of stakeholders. So the project delivery method had to be well considered and structured for it to be successful. Overall, the estimated project capital cost, time, and continue to be around $2.2 billion, and that was assumed to be at the time and ended up involving a $900 million New Start's full funding grant agreement. So there was the federal government also involved in the process. As we were starting on the path to deciding whether a P3 was appropriate for the Purple Line, we faced a variety of challenges. Not least of all was challenge that transit P3s were still fairly uncommon in the United States context. And so we had both a state that had limited experience with P3s. There were some experience earlier, but not necessarily as for very, very large projects, and certainly unfamiliarity with P3s for transit and P3s involving availability payments. The existing MDOT team structures were not necessarily set up yet to address the needs of an intensive P3 procurement. So we needed to think about how our resources were structured. And very importantly, the P3 industry was not aware that we were starting to think along these lines and that we were starting to test the waters and think about what kinds of competition we could attract for a project of this complexity in the transit context. So early on, we looked very closely at some of the peer experiences, including the Eagle P3 project in Colorado and various projects that were being delivered as P3s, transit projects delivered as P3s in Canada, to get a sense for what we were supposed to expect of some of these projects and the types of communications we needed to engage in to make sure other people understood these types of projects as well as possible. Early on, and before starting with a P3 project, it's important to make sure everyone involved is working with the same overall definition of a P3, as I did at the beginning of this presentation. As long as everyone is talking the same language and has the same terminology, it can be much more, the process can go much more smoothly. And it will affect the overall strategy depending on what's in and what's out of the concept of a P3 for those that are dealing with a particular project. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, it is very important to identify the resources within the organization that will be focused on delivering a potential innovative project delivery approach, because it does require a higher level of effort, a greater focus on certain contractual and financial issues to make sure the project over a long period of time is successful. So identifying those resources both internally and externally up front helps the process move along. Some useful resources from US DOT Build America Bureau at the early stage of developing a P3 include various reports that are out there, including establishing a P3 program and successful practices for P3s. These types of documents help those who are building their programs within their organization to understand what were the best practices and effective approaches elsewhere that could be applied to their own programs. Another useful resource offered by the Build America Bureau are periodic 101 training sessions that help those at the very beginning stages of developing programs and projects to get a more extensive view of the possibilities and the resources that are out there. And those occur on a regular basis. Additionally, it is important to make sure there is a legislative and regulatory framework that enables the types of projects and project delivery method that you would be pursuing. During the time that we were developing the concept for the Purple Line as a project and as a potential P3, we were also in Maryland finalizing the process of revising the Maryland P3 law and establishing P3 regulations for MDOTs. This was critical because we wanted to make sure both the law and the regulations were appropriate for the types of projects that we were considering, including those like the Purple Line. The framework was very important to ensuring that the process went smoothly and was effectively engaged the private sector. There are resources that provide examples of P3 legislation elsewhere that I've listed here, some of the links such as NCSL and the Bipartisan Policy Center. In addition to those from the US DOT Build America Bureau, including a state-by-state overview of legislation. This proved to be very useful for us in Maryland as we were deciding which elements were most important for our P3 approach, and we certainly borrowed from our colleagues elsewhere when we found that certain provisions were appropriate for our context. This is a map, and there are many you'll find out there of various characteristics of enabling P3 enabling legislation, and this map changes over time as new states pass new legislation or they're altered, as ours was, to accommodate a broader range of projects. But it gives a good overview of how different each state may be approaching P3s and how the specific needs and goals of each state are addressed in their P3 legislation. Early on in the process is determining whether or not a project is appropriate for a P3 delivery approach and how that approach is structured versus other projects in the program. This is very much informed by the framework that has been established at both the state and agency level, and it is important to make sure that the elements of the potential P3 project are in alignment with the project delivery approach as early as possible. The evaluation of the purple line as a potential P3 was part of a larger assessment of Maryland DOT's portfolio of projects for potential innovative project delivery. So we were thinking about how this approach supported a wide range of projects, and the purple line emerged as one project that was potentially in alignment with a P3 for project delivery goals. Useful resources at this stage in the process include a P3 screening tool provided through USDOT that provides a checklist of potential considerations as a state or agency is considering certain projects for P3 delivery, and case study webinars that are available, many of which through the Baddock Institute partnership under the Build America Bureau, where the webinar outlines the process that certain projects followed to determine the suitability of a project delivery method. So both of those are very helpful as a state or agency is engaging in their own screening and scoping processes. Once the project is scoped and there are baseline characteristics that lend itself towards a P3, is the refinement of the business case, and this can be a period of time that is highly analytical and involves a large number of experts to provide help and considerations for advancement. This includes assessment of risk allocation and the potential development of value for money analyses. Value for money analysis compares the financial cost of traditional public sector delivery versus the financial cost of P3 delivery. USDOT does provide tools to support public entities in considering these issues, including a P3 value tool, very detailed training and tool package that helps public sector employees to think through what's really part of a value for money analysis and help to guide the development of the approach to assessing value of a potential P3. These resources are important for understanding whether or not there is value to the government of pursuing P3. Also very important for refining the business case is the market soundings and engagement with the industry, since competitive tension is important for any successful procurement, but particularly one that is complex and typically as large as those that are delivered as a P3. It's important to make sure that those in the industry find it to be an attractive approach for pursuit of the project. This involves everything from participating in conferences and informal discussions with the industry, the release of RFIs to gather written feedback for potential proposers, and potentially, depending on the size of the project and the information that must be communicated to industry, hosting of an industry forum that brings everyone together to gain a better understanding and to increase interest in the project. This is also all collectively important for providing advance notice to the private sector that a project is in the pipeline and that they should be forming their teams for potential pursuit as soon as possible, because that is a time-consuming process that the private sector needs some advance knowledge that a project is coming down the line. One important way in which USDOT has provided support during this phase is the ability to participate in regular roundtables that could bring together various participants for discussions about either specific strategies or projects or concepts related to projects to engage more with the industry. And of course, there are a large number of industry events out there throughout the year that provide opportunities to engage more with those who would be interested in bidding on projects. All of this work and all of this analysis, all of these steps support a sound and responsible decision-making process that would eventually result in a successful procurement. This is important to make sure that the project and the project delivery approach is resilient and that it proceeds on a timeline that is attractive to the private sector. The beginning of a procurement after the decision is made could begin with a release of a request for qualifications, shortlisting, and various iterations of draft requests for proposals, as we had with the purple line, in coordination with the shortlisted proposers. It is important to note that while you're also engaging with the private sector during the time of an initial RFQ and RFP process, it is critical to engage with the US DOT Build America Bureau, particularly if the project will involve some form of federal loan, such as a TIFIA loan or a RIF loan, or potentially private activity bonds. The processes for pursuing both of these are relatively lengthy, and it is important to start during the procurement process to set the stage for successful financial close farther down the line. The purple line did use both a TIFIA loan of approximately $875 million and an allocation of private activity bonds for the private sector to use also in the financing package. Many states will have their own process for making the project delivery decision with respect to a P3. For Maryland and the one that we followed for the purple line, there are two major sections or phases. The first phase is before the solicitation process, so the effort to engage with the political decision makers and those who would be signing off on a contract at the end of the process really happens early on. And we were required to achieve a review and designation by the Board of Public Works, which includes Maryland's treasurer, comptroller, and governor before a solicitation process started. This seems like potentially an extra step, but it's actually quite valuable in the Maryland context because it gave everyone an opportunity to speak up before a procurement began with respect to their concerns and the requirements for the procurement. This ensured that the procurement went more smoothly and that the final decision at the end of the process was informed by the discussions that occurred beforehand. So this is very specific to Maryland. Some states will have similar processes and some will have different elements depending on state level decision-making processes. And a major part of the P3 contract is the long-term operations and maintenance and the ways in which that is controlled within the contract. The long-term monitoring of a P3 is dependent on the contract terms, specifically the technical provisions that are in the overall package of documents that are produced during and after the procurement stage. In particular, the technical provisions lay out in detail the performance requirements in the execution of design, construction, operation, and maintenance activities. These are particularly complex in the purple line context because of the various elements involved with operations and maintenance of a light rail project. During procurement and contract development, it is important to determine whether the technical provision should be prescriptive and very constrained versus performance-based outcomes in the requirements. The performance-based requirements are more typical for P3s, allowing the private sector the flexibility to innovate, but at the same time, it does shift some level of control away from the public sector. So this is a very important decision-making process that has implications for the full duration of the contract term. US DOT does provide resources through the Build America Bureau to help think through these issues, including a draft availability payment concessions P3 model contract guide, which provides some ideas with respect to how contracts are pieced together. And then also information regarding monitoring and oversight for P3s, which is very helpful as P3s are unique, that they incorporate longer term functions. This is an example of the key performance indicators from the purple line that demonstrates the ways in which the availability payments are allocated over time, and the private sector, the ways in which the private sector must perform. Now, we've gone over the full range of steps that brought us to the delivery of the purple line. There are multiple steps, and all of these steps proved to be hugely valuable, particularly as we encountered political risks at various points in the purple line process. Each step is designed to make the project delivery approach more resilient to potential risk and to optimize value for the state or transit agency. Overall, this approach proved to be very helpful for the purple line, and going forward, we hope that more transit agencies and states will look to this type of process for projects in a similar way. At this point, I've concluded my presentation and will hand off to Christine for the next steps.
Okay, great. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put those in the questions box, and we'll just kind of get started. The first one is existing and projected Metro Rail funding sufficient to meet the long-term O&M needs?
Would you like me to take that?
Yeah, please. Jennifer.
Okay, great. Sure. And so the funding that has been established today, or that was established in the past year, the new dedicated funding, is really for capital purposes. And it was determined that there's approximately about a 10 to 15 year backlog on the existing capital program, and that WMATA needed to be able to ramp up their capital program to about $1.5 billion a year in order to work down that backlog in about a 10-year period. And so that was going to require a new $500 million of additional funding over existing funding levels enabled to make that happen. So that's really where the additional $500 million came from, and what that will go for. As far as the operating funding goes, those funds are shared by all of the jurisdictions based on a formula. There have been significant increases in recent years for the subsidies that are being paid by all of the jurisdictions. And that's driven by a couple things. One of them is ridership has been going down, a lot of it related to reduced service and reliability issues. But also operating costs have been going up, and for a lot of different factors, some of them that are nationwide factors, but also some that were specific to WMATA, and including some labor costs. So in the legislative assemblies, both in Virginia and Maryland, established a cap of no more than 3% increase on the locality's operating expenses each year. There are some exceptions to that for, major capital projects that we know are coming open, like the Dulles Silver Line project, and some other limited exceptions. But that was really intended to try to keep the operating cost at sustainable levels, because a lot of the funds for operating does come from the general budgets of all of the local and state jurisdictions, and that was coming to levels that were approaching not being sustainable. So hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you. Let's switch over to Jodie. Did the funding mechanisms for the Purple Line directly involve participation from the University of Maryland, assuming that students and staff both use the Purple Line?
The funding portions of the Purple Line were some of which came from local sources, such as the counties where the university is located. The conversations with the community, the broader community, did involve the university, but the funding sources were not directly drawn from the university.
Okay, and we'll keep with you for a moment. How did MDOT, hold on, let me reread this question. It says, great detail on how to set up a P3 approach and how MDOT did it for the Purple Line. But this person is asking, they still want to know why should we follow a P3 approach?
Why should we follow a P3 approach? There are a variety of reasons, and they're not appropriate for all projects. And I think that from the perspective of the Purple Line, we did go through this process to make sure that the P3 approach was appropriate. It wasn't necessarily clear up front whether or not it was appropriate, certainly given that very few transit projects were delivered in this way. So it's really project specific. Each project should be assessed based on the ways in which the risk allocation between the public and private sector create value, and the ways in which the unique characteristics of a public-private partnership can result in potential faster delivery of the project, more efficient delivery of the project, more efficient operations of the project, operations and maintenance of the project over time. Lower costs overall due to efficiencies from private sector management. There's a whole range of ways in which it can be a good reason to pursue P3, but it's not necessarily something that is the same answer for every type of project. So I strongly encourage everyone to kind of think about the ways in which P3s can bring value and benefits to projects, and to think about the ways in which these are applicable to the projects in portfolios.
Thanks, Jodie. Jennifer, the high occupancy toll projects in Northern Virginia seem to be based on attaching requirements for multimodal projects to toll concession contracts. What are the economic, administrative, and/or political advantages to privatizing the transit improvements program versus using tolls as a funding source for a public agency-run improvements program?
So I guess a few things. First of all, each of the projects was a little bit different in terms of how the transit elements were handled. And again, in all of these cases, the very important thing is being able to demonstrate that all of these projects combined with the hot lanes are moving more people through the corridor, and it's actually improving the performance of the corridor as well. So in I-66, outside the Beltway, as I mentioned before, the transit's actually considered a part of the component of the scope of work. But a decision was made early on not to actually have the concessionaire bid on operating the transit itself, because we felt there would be a lot of redundancy with some of the existing publicly operated services in the corridor. So what we did was we put together a plan along with some cost estimates, and figured out, working with some of the existing operators, how much some of those services would cost. With I-66 inside the Beltway, it's a little different because we have projects being submitted by the localities that are taking advantage of the revenue stream created by the new hot lanes. And again, they all have to be justified based on how many people they're moving through the corridor and performance improvements. And that's somewhat similar for 395 and 95 as well, in terms of the off-the-top payment that's coming from the concessionaires. So I guess the second part of that sounds like the question was talking about some of the institutional issues. I think the most important point that we made is that this is not the projects themselves are not about trying to generate new revenue for transit. The projects are about moving people through very congested corridors by whatever means necessary, and making sure that the infrastructure investments that are being made can support that person throughput. And so that's really how we have justified that. And when we've been working with elected officials and others, it's so it would be very much about how they are being able to demonstrate again what the person throughput benefits of all of these improvements are. Like I said, we did look at the opportunity of privatizing this, and in our estimation, it was going to be more cost effective and transparent to allow the existing public operators to continue to use it. But I don't think that means we would rule out the possibility of private operations in the future with any of these revenue sources.
Thank you. Next question. Value capture mechanisms such as tax increment reinvestment zones have been used for transportation projects. Is this mechanism being used nationally? This is for either of you.
This is Jodie. I think, I mean, we've certainly seen many of those used nationally, and it really, again, depends on the project specific characteristics and more importantly, the local characteristics of what where the whatever revenues would be raised. We actually did think about approaches like this for supporting the Purple Line in Maryland and other projects in Maryland, and due to a variety of considerations, it proved to be less useful for a project of this type, but we have certainly since then seen similar strategies being applied elsewhere to fund and finance, certainly transit infrastructure similarly.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about there's a couple examples in Virginia of some value capture that's being used for, first of all, the Silver Line project in Northern Virginia. In Fairfax County, they're using tax increment financing or value capture to provide about $400 million for phase 1 of the Silver Line. I think for phase 2, they were generating another $200 to $300 million around the station areas. Similarly, in Alexandria, they have developed a value capture strategy to fund the Potomac Yard Metro project, and I believe that's generating about $200 to $220 million through increased tax revenues, property taxes and sales taxes that they're using for to help offset the cost and fund the station. So those are, I know, a few of the projects I'm aware of. It's really been oriented in Virginia much more to Metro Rail projects than any bus projects that we've seen to date.
Okay, thank you. We've run out of questions. So unless either of you have any other final comments, which it doesn't look like, I guess we're going to wrap up early on this Friday afternoon. So Jennifer and Jodie, thank you for joining us. This was really great. I personally like it when we have a transportation session, just because I don't normally engage too much with transportation planning. So I enjoy my time learning about this kind of stuff. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our call, and for those that typed questions in. And just remember that we will have a copy of this webcast, recording of it on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube, and we'll have a PDF of the session available here shortly up on our Webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So thanks, everyone, and thank you to the Transportation Planning Division for hosting today's session, and we will talk to everyone next time. Have a great weekend, everyone.